Hello everyone, Raccoon Pat here, and well, I want to show you something and tell you a little story of what character this guy's gonna be. So follow along with me as I explain, my fellow plebeians, about my version of Clinchfield 311. In order to fully tell the story, we must go way back to 1931. The Clinchfield took notice of how certain freight jobs were getting out of hand. So they reviewed several designs, some of them being the Challengers, Northerns, and many others. However, they decided to order a one-off prototype of the 482. This, of course, was similar to the design of the T-54 or the Frisco. However, there were some differences here and there. First of all, it didn't have any torpedo tube air tanks. It had a larger wheel diameter, and of course the most part of it had a higher boiler pressure, around 250. When the engine first came out of the shops, it was unlike anything the crews of the Clinchfield had ever had. In fact, it was so odd, nobody even noticed that the Type A poppet valve gear that the engine came out with. However, the engine himself was actually... He was very shy, and he kept most to himself. He wasn't mean-spirited, he was just shy and nervous. And of course, his original number was, of course, to be 3110. However, the number 0 wasn't painted on time. It was painted later on, but still, there was still some confusion between this engine and the actual 311, which was a consolidation. Of course, when the engine soon came out, he immediately went to work pulling the heaviest freight trains, and he did very well. In fact, his street speeds about between 75 and 80 miles an hour. He even pulled some passenger trains on the way then. However, his poppet valve gear and his one-off design came with several flaws. First of all, he had Franklin poppet valve gear, well, the Type A apparently, which apparently due to the experimental nature of this so-called valve gear and the materials available at the time, it wasn't quite successful, and the engine was in and out the shops multiple times. And some of the switchers even held some bets over what would happen. Mostly it'd be valve gear, sometimes it's normal average things. But he was always in and out, and he was getting quite frustrated. And so was the board, who decided not to base another design off of him and opted with the Challengers as their main freight haulers. But for our friend here, he was then later sold and was sent to Colorado, not for some short line as some people may believe, but he was actually sold to the Rio Grande. In fact, he actually worked the Tennessee Pass line along with several other engines, including the Rio Grande's own challenge, the own mountains, articulated, the westerns, everything. However, he also worked some interchange duties with the narrow gauge, and some he actually befriended. In fact, it was right then and there the Rio Grande decided to convert him from Franklin Poppet Valve to Walsharts, and it actually proved his performance. However, when the Rio Grande dieselized in the mid-1950s, the engine, who became Clark, which was a name given to him by the narrow gauge engines, was of course retired in favor of the diesels. However, the Rio Grande did not scrap him right away, and he was soon left at the old shops in Denver, Colorado, underneath the ownership of the then CEO at the time, who promised him he could be sold to another buyer. That buyer became the Highland Valley line. Later became known as the Hill Branch of the American Northern Railroad. And after a complete overhaul in the Denver shops, he then arrived underneath his own power in Minnesota after saying goodbye to some of his narrow gauge friends. He then arrived at Highland Valley at the town of Trouble at Mill. Trouble at Mill, where the then Milwaukee Road interchanged with the Highland Valley. He then put himself into his work upon arrival, pulling some of the heaviest freight trains into the Highland Valley line ever seen. But then that work became too much for him. So a 410-2 from the Southern Pacific was bought, named Winston. And of course, he and Clark began to share most of the heaviest work. And of course, Clark did pull some of the passenger trains. And of course, some of the workman trains, as they were called. This was, of course, a train of 5 heavyweight passenger cars from the Santa Fe, along with some other decent passenger duties. And of course, this continued all the way up until his tragic demise on February 14th. On November 14th of 1957. The day was a normal work day for Clark. He started his day with a bunch of coal trains coming from up and down the mountain, and of course, he would carry out a log train before he is scheduled to pull a workman's train in that very evening. However, when he arrived after he dropped off his log cars at the sawmill at their own private siting, and arrive at Highland Valley. He was surprised it wasn't just the Santa Fe heavyweights that was there waiting for him. Right behind the 5 heavyweights stood 8 streamlined passenger cars, which he hasn't pulled before. So, of course, he wasn't too surprised, but he was in awe of these passenger cars. One of them was a Pennsylvania car that was on the Southern Wind, I think the train was called. And of course, after coupling up to the passenger cars and was given the high sign, during the torrential downpour which was going on for the past few days, he then started his way down the mountain. The trip seemed to be normal as he picked up speed. Of course, the Highland Valley line's top speed was 60 miles an hour, and he managed to do that excellently. However, due to the downpour, he stayed within between 45 and 50. All went well until they reached bridge number 108. Clark's engineer then noticed there was a bent in the rails on the bridge. Clark saw it too, but before he even put on his brakes, it was already too late. He fell off. He hit the bent in the rails, and he turned on his right side and fell into the river below, taking all 5 of the heavyweight passenger cars with him. Miraculously, all the streamlined cars were safe, and they remained on the rails and came to a stop. Clark and the heavyweights, along with his crew and everybody on board the heavyweight coaches, they weren't so lucky. Among the 1,812 that were on board those heavyweight coaches, only 400 survived. Clark's engineer managed to survive the wreck. He managed to land on a tree by grabbing on one of its branches. Clark's fireman, well, he didn't survive the crash, and Clark himself didn't either. Clark's fireman's body will soon be found a week later, down the creek, along with 700 bodies. He's in a so-called shallow area. Apparently, when Clark hit the water, he also hit a rock which tore his smoke box in two, cracked his frames, and flooded his boiler tubes, cracking them in several places. Some say the complete impact managed to kill him instantly. But unfortunately, as we all learned to know, that wasn't the end. As years go by, and as more engines came to the Highland Valley line, sightings and reports of paranormal activity somehow rose on the line. A paranormal investigator soon came to the line and did an investigation and and of course did an EVP session, hoping to catch one of the ghosts to talk. He did, and the voice that he recorded was none other than Clark's. Years went by, and of course, a horrible man that goes by the name of Leroy Gump soon wrote in a newspaper about certain lies about Clark. He even got his sex wrong. He got his history all wrong, and he even gave Clark the name of Jessica, which of course it isn't true. Far from it. The owner of the Highland Valley line even took Leroy Gump to court and ended up winning. But the scandal was titillating, and it stick like glue. So then on after her, years after, her spots, reports of even seeing Clark fully appear began to show up. In the yard, some men were working on a flat car when they're working on a train of flat cars. When their cars suddenly jolted forwards and came to a stop about 5 feet, even though there was no locomotive connected to them. And the coupler that was left open was now closed, as if an engine had backed onto them. A headlight can even be seen. Going up the mountain. Sometimes there even a faint whistle and a bell. And of course, on the anniversary of his accident and the days leading up to it, and of course, sometimes a few days after the anniversary date, Clark can even be seen either standing still, like right here, or in motion, but no chuffing sound can ever be heard. Just a single clatter of wheels on metal rails. Of course, some of the people who use Leroy Kessler's papers as information calls Clark the Demon 311. However, to the engines and the workmen who knew Clark when he was alive, he'll always known as Clark the Clinchfield Ghost. There is even one incident I'll easily remember. I'll easily tell you. In a station 2 miles south along the line, south of Highland Valley, a station master was attending to his duties in the middle of the night, cleaning up the station and filing his reports and everything. Due to the storm, the telephone was of course dead, but he had his ear towards the backup system, which was a telegraph. In case anything would go on. When that said telegraph ran off, soon jumped to life, and when he read the code, he pondered, what he was even reading was even true. A steam engine was coming down the grade, but there was no crew in his cab. when he looked outside, he saw nothing, but he can hear something. He heard a mournful Crosby 3 chime in the distance. And then he can hear the rumbling of steel wheels on rails. He then turned off his station lights and looked to the north, and thought, and hopefully to sight the engine. He thought it was Eugene, the Lion Shay, playing a trick on him. But then he remembered Eugene, along with the other engines, are in the roundhouse at trouble at mill. Then it got louder and louder and louder. He then looked towards the north and saw something he thought he will never forget. A jet black engine rolling towards his station, rolling past, and he thought he heard it say, "Good night, William," as it rolled past. With the engine's headlight burning brightly down the line. The engine ran down the line and then vanished. He told this to his colleagues the next day, and then he was told about Clark. When the America Northern Railroad bought the line in 1991, or was it? Yeah, it was 1980. Yeah, it was actually 1980. In 1980, when America Northern took over the line, many of the A&R's own engines will not go on the line, because first of all, the Highland Valley line, now known as the Hill Branch, was already stocked up with engines. Second, they heard about the stories about Clark, and of course his corrupted name. Of course, there were several other engines that crashed on that line, but we're not here to talk about them. It wasn't until 1999 when a Hudson named Peter soon came onto the line as a temporary relief engine, while Winston and another engine was underneath overhaul. And then witness Clark's ghost up close and personal, in a very weird way. It was right after his stay on the line is when Leroy Gump's lies were soon made to the public. Paranormal groups, including the guys from both Ghost Adventures and Ghost Hunters, visit the line, and did indeed got some paranormal activity, but it seems, well, even in death, Clark can be still a bit shy. And would Clark ever go on? Would he ever find rest? Will he ever find peace? Well, no one can say for certain. But his paranormal activity his paranormal presence is not demonic. It wasn't even demonic to even begin with. In fact, his Clark's ghost is known to be very friendly. Be very, very friendly, a matter of fact. He even came into a dream once and apologized to Peter for slightly scaring him. But that's not either there or there. So remember, if you ever go to the old Highland Valley line, now known as the Hill Branch, and it's either a clear night, a full moon night, or a rainy night, listen very carefully. You may even see the ghost of Clark, the ghost engine of the Clinchfield.